It was a bright sunny afternoon in Carmel by the Sea, a quaint little town on the Californian coast. The town was alive with its usual charm, art galleries buzzing with tourists, cafes serving fragrant coffee, and the salty breeze carrying the whispers of the Pacific Ocean. But amidst the town's rustic tranquility, an unusual moment was about to unfold that would leave a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed it. Clint Eastwood, the town's legendary resident and former mayor, was seated at his favorite spot outside a local cafe. Despite his global fame, Clint was known for his approachable demeanor and love for simple pleasures. A cup of coffee, a good book, and the warmth of the town he loved so dearly. Today, he was enjoying his usual routine when a young girl, no more than 9 years old, approached him hesitantly. The girl had large, curious brown eyes that sparkled with innocence and a sense of wonder. Her hair was tied back in 2 messy pigtails, and she clutched a well-loved teddy bear under one arm. Her name was Sophie, and she was visiting Carmel with her family during the school holidays. Sophie had heard her parents whisper about the famous man who lived in the town, and when she saw Clint sitting alone, she couldn't resist the urge to talk to him. "Excuse me, sir," Sophie began in a soft voice, her small feet shuffling nervously on the cobblestone street. Clint looked up from his book, his rugged face breaking into a warm smile. "Well, hello there," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "What can I do for you, young lady?" Sophie hesitated, her fingers tightening around the teddy bear. "Are you Mr. Clint Eastwood?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's what they tell me," Clint replied with a chuckle. "And who might you be?" "I'm Sophie," she said, a little more confidently now. I have a question, but it's a big question. My mom says you're really wise and that you might know the answer." Clint set his book aside and leaned forward, intrigued. "A big question, huh? I'll do my best. What's on your mind, Sophie?" Sophie took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "do you believe in God?" The cafe fell silent as if the universe itself had paused to listen. A few passers-by stopped in their tracks, their curiosity piqued by the boldness of the little girl's question. Clint leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully as he regarded Sophie. "That is a big question," he said finally, his voice low and measured. "Why do you ask?" Sophie shifted uncomfortably. I don't understand. My grandma says God is everywhere, and he loves us no matter what. But my friend at school says there's no such thing as God, and that we're all alone in the universe. It makes me scared sometimes. I don't know who's right." Clint studied Sophie's face, her innocence contrasting starkly with the weight of her question. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the struggle to make sense of a world that often seemed too big and too complex. "Well, Sophie," he said after a moment, "I can't give you a simple answer because I don't think there is one, but maybe I can tell you a story. Would you like that?" Sophie nodded eagerly, her eyes wide with anticipation. Clint gestured to the chair across from him. "Have a seat," he said. "This story is about a little boy who once asked a question very similar to yours, and it changed his life forever." Sophie climbed into the chair opposite Clint, her teddy bear perched securely on her lap. A few patrons at nearby tables leaned in subtly, eager to hear the tale that Clint Eastwood was about to share. The actor took a sip of his coffee, his eyes distant as though summoning a memory from the depths of his past. "Well, Sophie," Clint began, his voice low and steady, "this story takes place a long time ago in a small town, not too different from Carmel. There was a boy named Johnny. He was about your age, full of curiosity and always asking questions. But there was one thing Johnny just couldn't understand. He wanted to know why bad things happen in the world. If God was real, why didn't he stop them?" Sophie leaned forward, completely engrossed. "What kind of bad things?" she asked softly. "Big things and small things," Clint replied. "He saw people lose their homes in storms. He saw kids in his neighborhood go to bed hungry. And sometimes people weren't kind to each other. Johnny would ask his mom, "If God is so powerful and loves us, why doesn't he make everything perfect?" But no one could give him an answer that made sense to him. Sophie's small brow furrowed. That sounds like how I feel sometimes, she admitted. Clint nodded. A lot of people feel that way, Sophie. Even grown-ups. Anyway, one day, Johnny was walking home from school when he saw an old man sitting on a bench by the park. The man had a long white beard and kind, twinkling eyes. He was feeding some birds, and they didn't seem scared of him at all. Johnny thought the man looked wise, so he decided to ask him his big question. What did the man say? Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Clint smiled. Patience, Sophie. Let's not rush the story. Johnny walked up to the man and said, Excuse me, sir, but can I ask you a question? The old man looked up and said, Of course, young one. What's on your mind? Johnny hesitated but finally blurted out, If God is real and loves us, why does he let bad things happen? Why doesn't he fix everything? Clint paused, letting the weight of the question sink in. Sophie's eyes widened, her small fingers clutching the teddy bear tighter. The old man didn't answer right away, Clint continued. Instead, he smiled and asked Johnny to sit with him. He handed Johnny a small bag of birdseed and said, Let's feed the birds together while we talk. So Johnny sat down, and they both started tossing birdseed onto the ground. The birds fluttered around them, chirping happily. Sophie tilted her head. What did feeding the birds have to do with God? She asked. Clint grinned. That's exactly what Johnny thought. After a while, he asked the old man, Why are we feeding the birds instead of talking about my question? And the old man said, But we are talking about your question. Don't you see? These birds rely on us to feed them right now. They can't ask for help, but we see their need and we act. That's what God does too, through us. Sophie's mouth fell open slightly. Through us? She repeated. Exactly, Clint said. The old man explained to Johnny that God doesn't always fix things directly. Instead, he gives people the ability to help one another. He said, When you feel kindness, compassion, and the urge to make the world a better place, that's God working through you. We're his hands and feet. He gives us the chance to be part of the solution. Sophie sat in silence, processing Clint's words. So, God doesn't just do magic to fix everything? She asked finally. Clint shook his head. Not in the way we'd expect, no. But the magic, Sophie, is that we get to be part of his plan. Every time you share, help, or show love, you're answering someone else's prayer. Sophie sat quietly, her mind racing with Clint's words. She looked down at her teddy bear, her small fingers running along its worn seams, as if searching for answers hidden in its soft fabric. Finally, she looked back up at Clint, her voice hesitant but steady. But, Mr. Eastwood, she asked, what if someone feels too small or too scared to help? What if they think they can't make a difference? Clint smiled, his gaze softening. That's a good question, Sophie, he said. And I'll tell you what the old man told Johnny next. He leaned forward slightly, his deep voice carrying an air of quiet authority, drawing Sophie and the small group of listeners closer into the moment. The old man said to Johnny, Do you see those tiny birds we're feeding? They're so small you'd think they couldn't do much in this big, wide world. But did you know that even the smallest creatures have a purpose? Birds plant seeds when they carry them in their beaks. They help trees grow in places far away. Something as simple as their flight changes the world in ways we can't see. Sophie's eyes lit up with wonder. Really? She asked. Really? Clint confirmed. The old man told Johnny, You may feel small sometimes, but every kind thing you do, no matter how small it seems, can grow into something much bigger. Maybe you smile at someone who's having a bad day, and that makes them feel better. Maybe they pass on that kindness to someone else. And before you know it, you've started a chain of goodness that touches more lives than you'll ever know. Sophie was quiet for a moment, her little brow furrowed in thought. So, even kids like me can make a difference? She asked. Absolutely, Clint replied. In fact, kids like you might make the biggest difference of all. You see the world with fresh eyes and big hearts. That's a gift. Sophie gave a small smile, but there was still a flicker of doubt in her eyes. But what if someone's really, really sad? What if they don't believe anyone cares? Clint's expression turned serious, his voice softening. That's where people like you and me come in, Sophie. Sometimes all it takes is one person to show someone that they're not alone. The old man told Johnny, when you see someone who's hurting, you don't have to fix everything for them. Just be there. Listen. Show kindness. Even the smallest light can shine in the darkest places. Sophie leaned back in her chair, her young face a mixture of contemplation and hope. I think I understand, she said finally. It's like God gives us the chance to be his helpers, right? Clint's smile deepened. You've got it, Sophie. The old man told Johnny, we're all connected. When you help someone, you're not just making their life better, you're making the whole world a little brighter. And that's what God wants us to do. What happened to Johnny? She asked quietly. Clint chuckled softly. Johnny grew up to be a man who always tried to help others, even in small ways. And whenever life got tough, he remembered the old man's words, be the light in someone's darkness. Sophie smiled, her eyes shining with determination. I want to be like that, she said. I want to be the light. Clint leaned back in his chair, his rugged face breaking into a proud grin. You already are, Sophie, he said. And don't ever forget it. Sophie beamed at Clint's words, her small frame seeming to carry a weight it didn't bear before. She glanced around, noticing that some of the cafe patrons had stopped pretending not to listen. A man sipping his coffee nodded in quiet agreement, while an older woman wiped a tear from her cheek. Sophie turned her attention back to Clint, curiosity still burning in her wide eyes. Mr. Eastwood, she said, have you ever had to be someone's light? Clint paused, his weathered hands resting on the table as he considered her question. You know, Sophie, he began slowly, there have been times in my life when I've had to make a choice. Stay in the shadows or try to bring light to someone who needed it. Sometimes it's not easy, but those are the moments that stick with you the most. Can you tell me one of those times? Sophie asked, leaning forward. Clint's gaze drifted to the horizon, the soft sound of waves breaking on the shore filling the momentary silence. Finally, he nodded. All right, Sophie, I'll tell you a story. He adjusted his position in his chair, his voice lowering as he began. Years ago, before I became an actor, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my life. I worked odd jobs trying to figure things out. One of those jobs was in a lumberyard, where I met a man named Sam. Sam was older than me, probably in his late 40s, and he didn't talk much. He had this way of keeping to himself, like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Sophie listened intently, her teddy bear now resting quietly on her lap. Most people ignored Sam because he wasn't the easiest person to talk to, Clint continued. But something about him made me curious. One day, during our lunch break, I noticed he didn't have anything to eat. Everyone else was busy with their own meals, but Sam just sat there, staring at the ground. So, I walked over and offered him half of my sandwich. What did he do? Sophie asked. At first, he looked at me like I'd done something strange, Clint said with a chuckle. But then, he took the sandwich and nodded. He didn't say much, just a quiet, thank you. After that, we started talking during breaks. Little by little, Sam opened up. He told me he'd lost his family in a car accident a few years earlier. He was trying to keep going, but he felt like he had no one left. Sophie's face fell, her young heart aching for the man Clint described. That's so sad, she whispered. It was, Clint agreed. But you know what Sam told me one day? He said, you sitting here with me, sharing your lunch, it reminded me that not everyone's forgotten about me. He said it gave him a reason to keep going, even on the hardest days. Sophie's eyes grew misty again. So you were his light, she said softly. Clint nodded. I suppose I was, in a small way. But the truth is, Sophie, it didn't feel like much at the time. It was just a sandwich and a conversation. That's the thing about being someone's light. It doesn't have to be grand or complicated. Sometimes, it's just about showing up and letting someone know they matter. Sophie sat back in her chair, her mind turning over everything Clint had said. "I think I understand now," she said. "God gives us chances to help, but it's up to us to take them. And even if it's something small, it can still make a big difference." Clint smiled, his eyes twinkling with pride. "That's exactly right, Sophie. You've got a wise heart." The cafe began to stir again, the moment's stillness giving way to the hum of conversation. Sophie looked around at the people nearby. Some strangers, some families, all of them connected in ways she hadn't noticed before. "I think I want to do something kind today," Sophie said suddenly, her voice filled with determination. Clint chuckled. "What do you have in mind?" Sophie thought for a moment, then hopped off her chair. "I saw a man sitting by the fountain earlier. He looked lonely. Maybe I'll go talk to him." Clint's smile deepened, and he gave her a small nod. "Go ahead, Sophie. You might just make his day." As Sophie walked away, clutching her teddy bear tightly, Clint watched her with a quiet sense of admiration. It amazed him how much wisdom could come from a child and how much hope they carried in their little hearts. Sophie had come to him with a question, but she was leaving with something far greater, a purpose. Sophie walked toward the fountain in the middle of the town square, her little pigtails bouncing with each determined step. The man she'd noticed earlier was still there, sitting on the edge of the stone basin. He was dressed in a worn gray jacket, his shoulders hunched as he stared at the water. His face was lined with years of hardship, and his hands, calloused and rough, rested heavily on his knees. Sophie hesitated for a moment, clutching her teddy bear for comfort. She thought about what Clint had said, that even small acts of kindness could make a big difference. Taking a deep breath, she walked up to the man. "Hello," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the gentle splashing of the fountain. The man looked up, startled by the sudden interruption. His tired eyes met Sophie's, and for a moment, he seemed unsure of what to say. "Hi," he replied gruffly, his voice rough like gravel. "What's a little girl like you doing here all alone?" "I'm not alone," Sophie said with a small smile, pointing back toward the cafe. "Mr. Clint Eastwood is right over there. He told me it's important to be kind to people who might need a friend. So, I thought I'd come and say hi to you." The man blinked, clearly taken aback. "Clint Eastwood, huh?" he said, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You sure you're not just pulling my leg?" Sophie shook her head earnestly. "Nope, he's sitting at the cafe. He's really nice, and he told me a story about helping people even in small ways. So I thought, maybe you could use someone to talk to." The man's expression softened, the weight on his shoulders seeming to ease just a little. "That's very kind of you," he said. "What's your name?" "Sophie," she said, holding out her hand. The man hesitated for a moment before taking her tiny hand in his large, rough one. "Nice to meet you, Sophie. I'm Jack." "Nice to meet you, Jack," Sophie said brightly. She glanced at the fountain and then back at him. "This is a nice spot. Do you come here a lot?" Jack nodded slowly. "Yeah, I like the sound of the water. It helps me think. Sometimes, when things get hard, I just sit here and try to figure it all out." Sophie tilted her head. "Are things hard for you right now?" Jack let out a heavy sigh. "Yeah, kid, they are. I lost my job a while back, and it's been tough trying to get back on my feet. Some days I feel like, well, like no one really notices if I'm here or not." Sophie's heart ached at his words. She tightened her grip on her teddy bear, then held it out to him. "Here," she said. "You can have Mr. Snuggles. He's really good at making people feel better." Jack stared at the teddy bear, his eyes widening in surprise. "I can't take your bear, Sophie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's yours." Sophie shook her head. "It's okay. I want you to have him. Mr. Snuggles has helped me a lot when I felt sad or scared. I think he could help you, too." Jack's hands trembled as he reached out to take the bear. For a moment, he just held it, staring at its worn, stitched face. Then, to Sophie's surprise, tears filled his eyes. He quickly looked away, wiping at his face with the back of his hand. "Thank you, Sophie," he said, his voice cracking. This means more than you know. Sophie smiled, her heart swelling with pride and joy. You're welcome, Jack. I hope things get better for you soon. Jack looked at her, a faint smile breaking through the sadness in his eyes. You know, Sophie, I think they already have. Thanks to you. Sophie's smile grew even wider. That's what Mr. Eastwood said. Sometimes, even little things can make a big difference. Jack nodded, clutching the teddy bear like it was a lifeline. He's a wise man, and you're a very special little girl, Sophie. Don't ever lose that kindness. Sophie waved goodbye to Jack, her heart light as she skipped back toward the cafe. Clint watched her approach, a knowing smile on his face. Well? He asked as she reached him. How'd it go? Sophie climbed back into her chair, her cheeks flushed with excitement. It went great. I gave Jack my teddy bear and he smiled. I think it made him feel better. Clint chuckled, his eyes twinkling with pride. I'm sure it did, Sophie. You've got a gift for making people feel seen and cared for. The world needs more of that. Sophie nodded thoughtfully, her mind already spinning with ideas of other ways she could help people. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, painting the town square in hues of gold and orange, she realized something important. Even the smallest gestures could shine a light in someone's darkest moments. And in that moment, Sophie decided she would spend the rest of her life being that light. As Sophie sat back down with Clint, she glanced at the fountain where Jack was still sitting, now holding Mr. Snuggles tightly. She couldn't help but feel a warm sense of accomplishment, as though she truly made a difference. Mr. Eastwood, she said, her voice filled with curiosity. Do you think Jack will be okay now? Clint nodded thoughtfully. I think you gave him something he's been missing for a long time, Sophie. Hope. Sometimes, all it takes is a little spark to remind someone that they're not alone in this world. You did that for him. Sophie grinned, her heart swelling with pride. It feels good to help people, she admitted. But what if I can't always fix everything? What if I make a mistake? Clint leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table as he looked at her with his steady gaze. That's a big question, Sophie, he said, and it's one a lot of people struggle with. The truth is, you won't always be able to fix everything. Sometimes people are hurting in ways we can't see, and no matter how much kindness we show, it might not feel like enough. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try. Sophie tilted her head, trying to understand. So, even if I can't fix something, I should still do my best to help? Exactly, Clint said with a small smile. Think of it this way. When you're walking in the dark and you light a match, it might not brighten the whole room, but it helps you see a little better, doesn't it? Sophie nodded. Yeah, it does. Well, every act of kindness is like lighting a little match, Clint continued. It might not fix everything, but it makes things a little brighter. And sometimes, that's all someone needs to take the next step. Sophie leaned back in her chair, her young mind turning over his words. That makes sense, she said after a moment. Even small lights can help in the dark. Clint smiled, impressed by how quickly Sophie grasped the concept. You're a smart kid, Sophie, and you've got something a lot of people lose as they get older. What's that? Sophie asked. Belief, Clint said simply. Belief that small things matter. Belief that one person can make a difference. Never lose that, Sophie. It's one of the most powerful things you have. Sophie nodded solemnly, as if she were taking an unspoken vow. She glanced back at the fountain one last time and saw Jack looking her way, a faint smile on his face. She waved at him, and he lifted a hand in return, his expression lighter than it had been before. Mr. Eastwood, Sophie said as she turned back to him. Have you ever felt like you couldn't fix something? Clint's face grew thoughtful, and for a moment, he seemed far away. I have, Sophie, he admitted. There were times when I felt like I failed, like I couldn't do enough for someone who needed help. But you know what I learned? What? Sophie asked, her voice soft with anticipation. I learned that sometimes, it's not about fixing everything, Clint said. It's about being there. It's about showing someone that they're not alone, even when you don't have all the answers. Sometimes, Just being present is enough. Sophie considered this, her small hands resting on the table. So, even if I don't know how to help, I can still make a difference by just being there? Clint nodded. That's right. A lot of people don't realize how much it means to have someone sit with them, listen to them, or just remind them that they matter. You don't have to have all the answers, Sophie. You just have to care. Sophie smiled, feeling a new sense of confidence. I think I can do that, she said. I know you can, Clint replied with a warm smile. And the world's a better place because of people like you. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the town square, Sophie felt a deep sense of peace. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. She could make a difference, even in small ways. Thank you, Mr. Eastwood, she said, looking up at him with shining eyes, for answering my question and for believing in me. Clint chuckled, his voice rich with warmth. Thank you, Sophie, for reminding me why it's so important to believe in people. You've got a bright future ahead of you, kid. Keep being the light. Sophie nodded, her heart full, as she climbed down from her chair and gave Clint a quick hug. As she walked away, her steps light and purposeful, Clint watched her go, a sense of quiet admiration settling over him. Sometimes, he thought, the smallest lights shine the brightest. As Sophie skipped away from the cafe, she couldn't help but feel like the world had shifted ever so slightly. Not in the grand, earth-shaking way she imagined when reading her storybooks, but in a softer, more personal way, like the sun peeking through the clouds on a rainy day. She clutched the warm memory of Clint's words and her encounter with Jack close to her heart. As she wandered back toward her parents, who were now seated at a nearby bench watching her with curious smiles, Sophie spotted another figure, an elderly woman sitting on a park bench under the shade of a large oak tree. She was knitting, her hands moving in steady, practiced rhythm, but her eyes seemed distant, lost in thought. Something about her posture reminded Sophie of Jack before she'd spoken to him. Quiet, yet burdened. Sophie hesitated. Could she try again? Could she do for this woman what she had done for Jack? With a deep breath, she approached the bench. Excuse me, she said politely, her voice light and hesitant. The woman looked up, her sharp, gray eyes meeting Sophie's. Yes, dear? She asked, her voice warm but tired. I just wanted to say hello, Sophie said, offering a small smile. I'm Sophie. The woman's face softened, and she set her knitting needles down. Hello, Sophie, she said. My name is Margaret. Are you out here enjoying the sunshine today? Sophie nodded enthusiastically. Yes, and I'm also trying to be kind to people. My friend Clint told me it's important to make others feel special. Clint, Margaret repeated with a chuckle. That's quite a wise friend you have there. He is, Sophie said earnestly. He told me a story about helping people, and it made me want to help too. Margaret leaned back on the bench, her knitting resting in her lap. That's a beautiful thing, Sophie, she said. The world could use more people like you and your friend Clint. Sophie beamed. Do you like knitting? She asked, noticing the half-finished scarf in Margaret's lap. Oh, yes, Margaret said, a hint of a smile touching her lips. I've been knitting for as long as I can remember. It keeps my hands busy and helps me feel calm. Sophie tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. Who are you making the scarf for? Margaret's smile faltered slightly, and she hesitated before answering. It's for my granddaughter, she said softly. Her name is Lily. She passed away a few years ago, but I like to knit things for her anyway. It makes me feel close to her. Sophie's heart squeezed at Margaret's words. She didn't fully understand the pain of losing someone, but she could see the sadness in Margaret's eyes. I think Lily would love the scarf, Sophie said sincerely. It's so pretty, and it shows how much you love her. Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she reached out to pat Sophie's hand gently. Thank you, dear, she said. That means a lot to me. Margaret smiled, a genuine warmth returning to her expression. Of course, Sophie. I'd like that very much. For a while, they sat together in companionable silence, the only sounds coming from the rustling leaves above and the rhythmic click of Margaret's knitting needles. Sophie didn't say much. She didn't need to. Being there, sharing the moment, felt like enough. After some time, Margaret looked down at Sophie and said, "You have a very special heart, my dear. Don't ever lose that kindness." Sophie looked up at her with wide eyes. "That's what Mr. Eastwood said, too." Margaret chuckled. "Well, it sounds like he's a very smart man. And he's right. The world needs people like you, Sophie. People who see others and take the time to care." Sophie nodded, feeling a deep sense of pride. "I'm going to keep being kind," she said firmly, "even if it's just little things." Mr. Eastwood said little things can make a big difference. "They certainly can," Margaret agreed. She reached into her knitting bag and pulled out a small, colorful ball of yarn. "Here," she said, handing it to Sophie. "Take this. Maybe one day you'll learn to knit, and you can make something special for someone, too." Sophie held the ball of yarn in her hands, her eyes wide with wonder. "Thank you, Margaret," she said, her voice bright with excitement. "You're welcome, dear," Margaret said. "And thank you for sitting with me and reminding me how important it is to share kindness." Sophie hugged the ball of yarn to her chest, her heart full. As she skipped back to her parents, she couldn't help but feel like she was carrying a little piece of Margaret's love with her. From the cafe, Clint watched Sophie with a smile, his heart warmed by her unwavering spirit. In her, he saw a reflection of the kind of goodness the world needed, a light that could shine even in the darkest corners. Sophie returned to her parents, her small hands clutching the ball of yarn Margaret had given her. Her parents, Sarah and Daniel, looked at her with curious smiles, having observed her interactions from afar. "What's that you've got there, sweetheart?" Sarah asked as Sophie plopped down onto the bench beside her. "It's yarn," Sophie said brightly, holding it up for them to see. "Margaret gave it to me. She said maybe one day I can learn to knit and make something special for someone." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Margaret? Who's Margaret?" "She's the nice lady sitting under the tree over there," Sophie explained, pointing toward the bench where Margaret was still seated, her hands busy with her knitting. "She's making a scarf for her granddaughter, Lily. Lily's in heaven now, but Margaret says knitting makes her feel close to her." Sarah and Daniel exchanged a glance, their expressions softening. "That's very sweet of her," Sarah said gently. "And it sounds like you've made another friend today, Sophie." "I think so," Sophie said, her face lighting up. "And I met a man named Jack earlier, too. He was sad, so I gave him Mr. Snuggles." Daniel looked surprised. "Your teddy bear? You gave it away?" Sophie nodded. "He needed it more than I did. Clint said little things can make a big difference, so I thought Mr. Snuggles could help Jack feel better." Sarah's eyes welled up with tears, and she reached over to brush a strand of hair from Sophie's face. "You have such a kind heart, Sophie," she said. "We're so proud of you." Sophie grinned, her cheeks flushing with happiness. "I'm just trying to do what Clint said, be the light." Daniel's eyebrows furrowed slightly. "Wait, Clint? Clint Eastwood? Is he really here? Or is this part of your imagination?" "Sweetie," Sophie giggled. "He's really here. He's sitting at the cafe. You can meet him if you want." Sarah and Daniel exchanged amused glances but decided to humor her. "All right," Daniel said. "Let's go meet this Clint Eastwood of yours." Sophie grabbed their hands and led them toward the cafe, her steps light with excitement. When they arrived, Clint was still sitting at his table, his sharp eyes scanning the square as if he were soaking in every detail. He looked up as Sophie approached, a smile tugging at his lips. "Mr. Eastwood," Sophie called out, waving at him. "I brought my mom and dad to meet you." Clint stood, towering over Sophie's parents, and extended a hand to Daniel. "Clint Eastwood," he said in his trademark gravelly voice. "Nice to meet you." Daniel's jaw dropped slightly, and Sarah's eyes widened. "Oh my goodness," Sarah said, a hand flying to her mouth. "You weren't kidding, Sophie. It's really him." Clint chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "She's a sharp one, your daughter," he said. "Got a heart as big as this whole town." Daniel shook Clint's hand, still a little starstruck. It's an honor to meet you, sir. We've watched so many of your movies. Appreciate that, Clint said with a nod. But the real star here is Sophie. She's got a knack for spreading kindness, and that's more impressive than anything I've done. Sarah knelt beside Sophie, looking at her with shining eyes. You really made a difference today, didn't you, sweetheart? Sophie nodded earnestly. I just did what Clint said. Be kind and help people. It feels really good to make someone smile. Clint crossed his arms, a proud smile on his face. She's got the right idea. You've got a special kid here. Daniel laughed, shaking his head in disbelief. We know. She surprises us every day. Sophie beamed, basking in the praise from her parents and her new friend. As they all stood together in the golden light of the afternoon, Sophie felt a sense of belonging and purpose that she couldn't quite put into words. Mr. Eastwood, Sophie said after a moment, do you think I can keep helping people, even when I grow up? Clint crouched down so he was eye level with her, his face serious but kind. I don't just think you can, Sophie. I know you can. The world needs people like you no matter how old you are. You've got a gift, and it's up to you to keep using it. Sophie nodded, her resolve solidifying. I will, she said firmly. I promise. Clint smiled, standing up and patting her lightly on the head. That's what I like to hear. As Sophie's parents thanked Clint for his time and shared a few more words of admiration, Sophie turned her gaze back toward the square. Jack was still at the fountain, cradling Mr. Snuggles, and Margaret was knitting peacefully under the tree. The world seemed brighter, more connected, and Sophie knew deep down that this was just the beginning of her journey to spread kindness wherever she went. As Sophie's family walked away from the cafe, Clint watched them go, his heart filled with a rare sense of hope. He had been around long enough to know how the world could wear people down, make them cynical, and drain the kindness from their hearts. But Sophie was different. Her innocence and genuine desire to make the world better reminded him of something he hadn't felt in a long time: belief in the next generation. Sophie, meanwhile, held tightly to the ball of yarn Margaret had given her. As they passed the fountain, Jack noticed her and waved tentatively. Sophie let go of her parents' hands and ran over to him. Hi, Jack, she said cheerfully, her ponytail bouncing as she stopped in front of him. Hey, Sophie, Jack replied, his voice a little steadier than before. Mr. Snuggles rested in his lap, and there was a soft smile on his face, a stark contrast to the defeated expression he'd worn earlier. Thanks again for this, he said, patting the stuffed bear. You're welcome, Sophie said, her eyes sparkling. I'm glad Mr. Snuggles is helping you. Jack looked at her for a moment, as if weighing his words. He is, he admitted. But it wasn't just the bear. It was you. The way you talked to me, the way you cared. I didn't think anyone even noticed me sitting here. But you did. Sophie's face lit up. Of course I noticed. My mom always says everyone deserves to be seen. Jack chuckled softly. Your mom's right. And you've got a gift, Sophie. Don't ever lose it. Okay? I won't, Sophie said with conviction. And you promise to take care of Mr. Snuggles. Okay? Jack nodded. I will. And I'll try to take care of myself, too. Sophie gave him a big smile and waved goodbye before running back to her parents. Jack watched her go, a new determination settling in his heart. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't alone, like he mattered. As the days turned into weeks, Sophie's simple acts of kindness began to ripple through the community. Jack, inspired by Sophie's compassion, started volunteering at the local community center, helping others who were struggling. He found a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Margaret, touched by Sophie's innocent sincerity, began teaching knitting classes at the senior center, sharing her craft with others and finding joy in the connections it brought. She even made a special scarf for Sophie, a bright, multicolored piece that Sophie proudly wore everywhere. Even Clint, who had been visiting the town to escape the hustle and bustle of Hollywood, found himself reflecting on his own life. Sophie's unwavering belief in the power of small acts made him think about how he could use his platform to inspire others. he decided to work on a documentary highlighting unsung heroes, ordinary people like Sophie who were making a difference in their communities. Years later, Sophie's parents would often remind her of that special day in the park. By then, Sophie had grown into a young woman, her heart still full of the same compassion and drive to help others. She went on to start a non-profit organization called Be the Light, dedicated to encouraging acts of kindness and providing resources for those in need. Jack became one of the non-profit's biggest supporters, crediting Sophie with helping him turn his life around. Margaret, now a beloved community figure, knitted scarves for all the children Sophie's organization helped. And Clint, true to his word, completed his documentary, dedicating it to the little girl who reminded him of the power of kindness. One day, as Sophie stood on stage at an event for her nonprofit, she spoke to a packed audience about that pivotal day years ago. She told them about Clint Eastwood, Jack, Margaret, and the lesson she had learned, that even the smallest gestures could create ripples that changed lives. If a little girl with a teddy bear can make a difference, Sophie said, her voice clear and steady, then so can each and every one of you. The world isn't perfect, but together, we can make it brighter, one small light at a time. As the audience erupted into applause, Sophie looked out at the sea of faces, her heart swelling with gratitude. She thought of Clint's words, of the lives she had touched and the lives still waiting to be changed. And she knew, without a doubt, that she was exactly where she was meant to be.